Odilon Rodin could paint a perfectly respectable portrait. He knew exactly what a face looked like. He could draw a horse, and when he wanted a human face to look human, it did. So why did he choose to make this? Or a man growing into a cactus? Or an eye floating through the sky? Rodin understood the visible world perfectly well, and for decades he used it to build things that could never exist. Chapter 1. He knew what things looked like. Rodin spent much of his childhood away from his immediate family. He had been born in Bordeaux in 1840, but poor health meant that much of his childhood was spent at the family's country estate outside the city rather than in the Bordeaux family home. He later remembered himself as a quiet child who watched clouds and shadows closely. From very early on, though, somebody was teaching him to look. He studied drawing in Bordeaux with Stanislas Guérin, who introduced him to Delacroix. His family, meanwhile, pushed him towards something they considered safer: architecture. Rodin failed the entrance exam for the École des Beaux-Arts, then spent an unhappy stretch in the Paris studio of Jean-Léon Gérôme, one of the most respected academic painters of the day. The problem wasn't that he couldn't draw, it was that he didn't fit the system built to teach him. The surviving work is calm, careful, observed, self-portraits, landscapes, a horse and rider with real anatomical understanding. A landscape etching was accepted at the Salon in 1867. Then he found a teacher who actually mattered. Back in Bordeaux, Rudolf Bresdan was a printmaker living in near poverty, about as far from the Beaux-Arts as it was possible to get. He taught Rodin etching, and something more important than etching, how to build a fantastic world out of pieces that were, individually, stubbornly real. In October 1870, the training was interrupted. Rodin entered military service in the Franco-Prussian War. He was sent to the Loire and served there until illness forced his discharge the following winter. He would later call it a turning point. He came home, kept sketching from life, and moved permanently to Paris in 1874. 5 years after that, he published his first album of lithographs. He called it Dans le rêve, In the Dream. It was the first time the Rodin we know today stepped fully into view. Chapter 2. He built monsters from real things. His black drawings and lithographs became known as his noir, and from the start, he treated black as more than the absence of colour. Charcoal could dissolve a body into darkness, or push a face out of a black field like something surfacing from beneath. Lithography let those private worlds circulate in albums instead of staying locked in a single drawing. He also had, by this point, an unusual friend. Rodin had known the botanist Armand Claveau since he was in his teens. Claveau studied freshwater algae and took the young Rodin seriously. Through him, Rodin encountered evolutionary thought, philosophy, Baudelaire, and Edgar Allan Poe. The two of them also spent time looking at microscopic life. That connection is important because Rodin's creatures stop looking random when you put them beside the science opening up around him. The 19th century was revealing structures nobody had previously been able to see, and under a microscope, the ordinary world was already producing things that looked alien. Rodin could take the form of a cell, an eye, a plant, an embryo, and move it somewhere that it didn't belong. A man's head would start behaving like a plant. A spider could grow a human face and somehow still look as though it belonged to the same body as the rest of the drawing. He gave these pictures titles like There Were Also Embryonic Beings and Man Appeared, questioning himself about his origin. Those titles put the drawing squarely inside one of the century's great obsessions, where life came from and where the boundaries between different kinds of life actually lay. In 1883, he published an album called Les Origines, The Origins, early life stumbling between plant, animal, and human form without ever settling properly into any of them. The floating eye works on the same logic. An eye is a real thing, and so is a balloon. Rudon simply puts them together in a way reality never would, and gives the eye somewhere impossible to go. He wasn't inventing his creatures out of nothing. He was using things people already recognised to make them accept something they had never seen. Chapter 3. The writers got there first. Some of Rudon's earliest champions were writers. In 1882, he published an album called A Edgar Poe. It is often described as Poe illustration, and that isn't quite right. Rudon was not illustrating individual stories. He used Poe as a starting point, then gave the images his own strange, suggestive titles. He did something similar with Goya 3 years later. 6 lithographs, not copies, an homage to a printmaker who had reached fantasy and dream logic long before he had. Then he found Flaubert, and Flaubert became close to an obsession. Rudon returned to the Temptation of St. Anthony 3 separate times in 1888, 1889, and 1896, producing new lithographs each time. He called Flaubert's book a literary marvel and a mine, and meant it literally. Flaubert's story is full of Christian imagery, and Rudon painted saints, Christ, and apocalypse subjects elsewhere too. None of that gives us a straight statement on Rudon's own faith. He borrowed just as happily from Buddhism and Greek myth, and resisted being pinned to any single creed. Then, in 1884, someone else discovered him, the novelist Maurice Carroll Huysmans, who put a fictional collection of Rudon's drawings into the hands of the aristocratic hero of his novel, Arabeur. Huysmans helped make Rudon fashionable with the literary avant-garde. He also helped begin a habit that has followed Rudon ever since, describing these drawings using the language of sickness and delirium, a reading a certain kind of critic never quite abandoned. Rudon's actual life at that moment gave him grief, not delirium. His younger brother died of tuberculosis in 1884. His sister died weeks later. In 1886, his first son, Jean, was born and lived only a few months. Rudon kept working. Chapter 4. He married colour. Around 1890, something startling began to happen to Rudon's work. The strange heads didn't disappear. They started to acquire colour. Closed eyes is almost the perfect bridge, because Rudon made this same face in charcoal, lithograph, pastel, and paint. The inward expression still belongs to the noir, but pale skin and blue shadow are now doing the work that black could not. Colour didn't make him less precise. This is his son, Ari. These are Violet Hyman and Madame Arthur Fontaine. Whatever Rudon does to a spider or a floating head, these portraits make one point hard to argue with. When Rudon wanted a human face to behave, he could give you one. Ari had been born in 1889, close enough to the expanding colour work that it encouraged a satisfyingly neat story ever since. The grieving artist finds a new son, and darkness gives way to light. The paintings refused to cooperate. Rudon had used colour years earlier, and kept making black work for years afterwards. What changed wasn't the man overnight, it was the amount of colour he was prepared to let into the work. The flowers prove it. He'd been painting them as far back as the 1860s. Decades later, they have almost escaped the vase, spreading across the painting until it becomes hard to tell where the bouquet ends and the colour space begins. There was a practical side too. Later in life, Camille grew and arranged flowers at their house outside Paris. Rudon painted them and collectors bought them. The artist of floating eyeballs had found a subject people were very happy to hang over the sofa. There is no reliable evidence, incidentally, that Rudon ever travelled to Japan. Japanese art came to him. By the 1890s, France was awash with Japanese prints, and Rudon absorbed their flattened space and unfamiliar balance the way he absorbed everything else. He took something real from the world around him and made it his own. Chapter 5. The impossible gets bigger. Then somebody asked Rudon to put his world on a wall. In 1899, Baron Robert de Mussy commissioned him to decorate the dining room of his chateau in Burgundy. Even Rodin's strangest work, until then, could be shot inside a frame or closed inside a book. The Mussey changed the scale. Plants spread across enormous panels. Colour occupies areas where you would expect perspective. Forms appear, dissolve and reappear somewhere else across the wall. The private dream had become a room people could walk into. Rodin kept pushing the scale further. He returned repeatedly to Apollo, racing across the sky, horses twisting inside the colour rather than standing neatly in front of it. Put one of these next to the careful horse and rider from 30 years earlier, and the point becomes almost unavoidable. Recognition finally caught up with him. He was given the Legion of Honour in 1903, then a room of his own at the Salon d'Automne, where Closed Eyes became the first Rodin the French state ever bought. In 1913, the Armory Show gave New York an enormous body of his work. At 72, he could easily have spent the rest of his career painting the flowers people already wanted. Instead, around 1914, he painted this: a giant, one-eyed creature peering across a hillside at a sleeping woman below. The colour could not be more confident, and the subject could not be further from safe. More than 30 years had passed since the spiders, the embryonic beings, and the floating eye. Rodin had changed his materials, his scale, and his audience. He had not lost his appetite for the impossible, however. When the First World War began, his son Arie went to the front. Rodin kept working while he waited for news. He died in Paris on the 6th of July, 1916, aged 76. Arie, sadly, reached the city too late to see his father alive. I enjoy Rodin's more traditional work, and it makes clear to me that he was a competent artist. But the black and white drawings are the ones that affect me most. Some of them miss the mark, as I see it, and have an awkward, almost amateur artist feel. Then something like the crying spider lands dead centre. Those images are so visually arresting that, to me, they feel like the Eraserhead of their day. I'm not claiming a direct influence on David Lynch, but I cannot look at the best noir without thinking of Rodin as a kind of artistic grandfather to David Lynch. What makes the career extraordinary isn't that Rodin escaped from darkness into colour. It is that the same idea survived both. He studied plants closely enough to turn a man into one. He knew the human face well enough to put one on a spider and make us accept it, or just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Reality supplied the parts. Rodin changed the rules. He described his own method as putting the logic of the visible at the service of the invisible. More than a century later, that is still exactly what these images do. Click the thumbnail on screen now to watch the story of Franz Sedlacek, the artist who painted like Hieronymus Bosch and then vanished in 1945.